Late April 1945, somewhere east of the Elbe River in Germany. The Jeep's engine idled softly as Captain T. Moffett Burris gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath the grime of 6 straight days in combat. The young paratrooper from South Carolina stared through a dusty windshield at a column of German vehicles stretching endlessly ahead. Behind him sat his lieutenant and a sergeant, rifles ready but useless against what lay before them. 15,000 German soldiers from an armored Panzer Corps. What happened next would defy every rule of military logic. 1 Jeep, 3 American paratroopers, and 15,000 enemy troops with tanks, artillery, and machine guns. Within 30 minutes, the entire German force would surrender without firing a shot. This wasn't about superior firepower or strategy. It was the result of one man's daring bluff and the psychological collapse of an army trapped between 2 superpowers. The road to that impossible moment began years earlier in a small South Carolina town. Thomas Moffett Burris was born in Anderson, South Carolina, on September 22, 1919. He grew up in textile mill country, where hard work and quiet resolve shaped his generation. After graduating from Clemson University, Burris became a history teacher at Orangeburg High School. By his own account, he was an easygoing small-town boy who hadn't been in a fight in years. He'd been part of Clemson's ROTC program, holding a reserve officer commission. His future seemed set, a calm life teaching teenagers in rural South Carolina. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Within days, America declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany declared war on America. Burris received orders to report for active duty in January 1942. At 22, the schoolteacher became a soldier, but he didn't want to be an ordinary one. He volunteered for the Paratroopers, a new elite airborne force that demanded everything from its men. Training was brutal, designed to break the weak. Many washed out. Burris didn't. He discovered something inside himself, a calm under chaos, the nerve to lead, and a willingness to take risks others wouldn't. By April 1942, Burris was assigned to the newly formed 82nd Airborne Division, becoming the first officer in the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 82nd was nicknamed the All-American Division because its soldiers came from every state in the country. Burris trained alongside farm boys from Iowa, factory hands from Detroit, cowboys from Texas, and dock workers from Brooklyn. Together, they became one of the toughest fighting units in U.S. military history. To the Germans, they earned a different name, devils in baggy pants. The phrase came from a German officer's diary found after the Battle of Anzio, describing the paratroopers as devils who were never more dangerous than when surrounded. The baggy pants referred to their loose airborne uniforms. It was high praise from an enemy who rarely gave any. By May 1943, Burris and his regiment shipped out to North Africa. His first combat jump came on July 9, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. His C-47 transport plane shook under heavy anti-aircraft fire. When the green light flashed, Burris jumped into the dark sky over enemy territory. He landed in an olive grove, gathered scattered paratroopers, and fought his way to the target. It was the first of many impossible missions he would lead. In September 1943, during the invasion of Italy at Salerno, the 504th jumped behind German lines to block reinforcements. For 5 days, Burris led his men through constant combat. Outnumbered, outgunned, but never beaten. General Mark Clark later credited the 504th with saving the Salerno beachhead. Then came Anzio, January 1944. What began as an amphibious landing turned into a 4-month nightmare of trench warfare. German artillery pounded American lines daily. Casualties were brutal. Burris was wounded twice but refused evacuation. He watched friends die in muddy foxholes and learned war wasn't about glory, it was survival. And he learned how to keep men fighting when every instinct told them to give up. His defining moment came in September 1944, Operation Market Garden. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery planned to end the war by Christmas. Allied airborne troops would seize key bridges across the Netherlands to clear a path into Germany. The 82nd Airborne's objective: capture the bridge over the Wall River at Nijmegen. Without it, the entire plan would collapse. On September 20th, Burris received the order that would test everything he'd learned. His company would cross the wall in collapsible canvas boats, in broad daylight, under German machine gun and artillery fire, then stormed fortified positions on the opposite shore. It was by any measure a suicide mission. 26 British assault boats, each about 19 feet long, were brought forward. Designed for 10 paratroopers and 3 engineers, they were overloaded with 16 men each. Many boats had only 2 or 3 paddles, forcing soldiers to use rifle butts to row. The river was 400 yards wide, and German positions covered every inch of the approach. At 2:57 p.m., the crossing began. As the boats pushed off, machine gun fire shredded them. Artillery shells exploded in the water. Men screamed, boats capsized, and the river turned red. Burris led I Company from one of the 2 lead boats. His craft took multiple hits within seconds. The engineer steering it, PFC Willard Jenkins, was killed instantly by a 20mm shell, his blood splattering across Burris's lap. Shrapnel tore into Burris's ribs. The boat was sinking, but he kept his men paddling. After 15 to 20 minutes of hell, they reached the far bank. 6 men left from 16. Only 13 boats from the first wave made it across. The assault cost between 24 and 48 killed, and about 70 seriously wounded, but they did it. Under relentless fire, Burris rallied the survivors and led them in a furious assault. Hand-to-hand combat erupted through the trenches. Grenades, bayonets, no mercy on either side. By nightfall, they held the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. 4 Sherman tanks from the British 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed around 7 p.m., but then they stopped. Burris waited and waited. When he demanded they move, the British tank commander, Captain Peter Carrington, refused without orders, saying 1 German anti-tank gun blocked the road. Burris, who had just lost half his company, exploded in fury. "I just sacrificed half my company in the face of dozens of guns, and you won't move because of 1?" American officers, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin, all tried to push the British tanks forward. None succeeded. They stayed idle for nearly a full day, not advancing until 11 a.m. the next morning, September 21st. By that time, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion at Arnhem Bridge, about 11 miles away, had been overrun. The British paratroopers who desperately needed help were forced to surrender. Years later, Lord Carrington, who would become Britain's Foreign Secretary, denied the heated exchange with Burris in his autobiography. But several American paratroopers confirmed it happened, recalling the frustration and anger of that moment. The British halt had its reasons: low ammunition and fuel, no infantry support, and an exposed elevated road that made tanks easy targets. Still, the clash showed a deeper divide: the bold, aggressive airborne mindset versus the cautious, by-the-book discipline of the Guards. Burris received the Silver Star for his leadership during the Wall River crossing. The citation praised his brilliant and inspirational heroism in securing the north end of the Nijmegen Highway Bridge. But Burris knew the truth. Bravery alone hadn't won that fight. It was audacity, the willingness to attempt the impossible, to bluff when the odds were hopeless, lessons that would serve him again 6 months later. In December 1944 came the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler launched his last desperate counterattack through the Ardennes forest. The 82nd Airborne rushed into combat with little food, ammunition, or winter clothing. They deployed to Verbemont, Belgium, where they blocked Kampfgruppe Piper at Chenu, handing the Germans their first defeat of the offensive. Burris and his men held firm against tanks and artillery in sub-zero weather. They endured constant shelling, frostbite, and exhaustion, but they never broke. By February 1945, they were pushing deep into Germany itself. The war's final months became a race, Soviets closing from the east, Americans and British from the west. Germany was being crushed between 2 massive armies. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in fire and blood. But the fighting wasn't over. Trapped German units fought with the desperation of men who knew their fate was sealed. On May 2, 1945, the 82nd Airborne liberated the Vöbelin concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found defied comprehension. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, skeletons wrapped in skin barely alive. About 1,000 bodies lay in open pits. Some evidence even suggested cannibalism among the starving. The stench was overwhelming. Men who had survived 2 years of combat vomited at the sight. Burris shot the lock off a door to free prisoners. He was among the first Americans to witness the atrocities firsthand. He ordered his troops to document everything with photographs. The world had to see proof of what the Nazis had done. Later, Burris said, "The concentration camp in Germany was the worst thing I saw in the entire war." The U.S. Army forced the townspeople of Ludwigslust to walk through the camp. They had to see what had been done in their name. On May 7th, the 82nd Airborne held funeral services for 200 victims in the town square. German citizens, captured officers, and hundreds of paratroopers attended. The division chaplain delivered a fierce eulogy. The crimes committed here in the name of the German people, and with their consent, are small compared to those in other camps. Here there were no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France were simply starved to death. Within 4 miles of your comfortable homes, 4,000 men lived like animals. Burris stood silently at attention. He had seen terrible things: friends blown apart by artillery, men drowning in the Vaal River, the horrors of Anzio, but nothing compared to Vöbelin. Nothing revealed human evil like that camp. He knew then that defeating Germany wasn't enough. The world had to ensure this would never happen again. By late April 1945, Allied commanders faced a decision. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east, while American forces had reached the Elbe River from the west. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered American troops to stop at the Elbe and let the Soviets take Berlin. The political future of Germany had already been settled at the Yalta Conference. Berlin would fall within the Soviet zone. There was no reason for Americans to fight for a city that would be handed to the Russians anyway. But Burris hated waiting. He was 25 years old, battle-hardened, and restless. Berlin was only 40 miles away, the war almost over, and he was supposed to sit still. That wasn't in his nature. He was a man of action. Waiting felt like torture. One day in late April, the exact date unknown, Burris made a decision. He told his lieutenant and sergeant, "I can't stand this any longer. Let's take my jeep across the river and see what's out there. Maybe there are still some Krauts." It wasn't an order or an official reconnaissance mission. It was just 3 paratroopers in a jeep, driving into enemy territory because Burris couldn't sit idle. They drove roughly 40 miles, about halfway to Berlin. The roads were jammed with refugees fleeing the Soviets, families pushing carts, crying children, exhausted old men and women staggering along. Germany had collapsed. Authority meant nothing. Fear ruled everything. Then Burris saw something that froze his blood. German military vehicles, dozens of them, then hundreds. An entire column stretched as far as he could see. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, troop carriers, supply trucks. This wasn't a few stragglers. It was a full Panzer Corps, maybe 15,000 men. Burris should have turned back. 3 men in a jeep had no business confronting a German armored corps. The logical move was to retreat, report the sighting, and let higher command handle it. But logic had never been Burris's defining trait. He had another idea, insane, reckless, but maybe, just maybe, it could work. He drove straight toward the column. His lieutenant and sergeant said nothing, just checked their rifles. If it went wrong, they'd go down fighting. The jeep rolled to a stop beside the lead vehicle. A German officer stood there, a captain, judging by his insignia. He spoke English. Lucky break. Burris climbed out and walked right up to him, calm and confident, hands visible. "I'm here to accept your surrender," Burris said evenly. His tone was steady, almost casual, as if driving 40 miles behind enemy lines to confront 15,000 armed Germans was the most normal thing in the world. The captain stared in disbelief, glancing past Burris to the lone jeep and 2 soldiers. No backup, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. His expression shifted from confusion to suspicion to something like amusement. He nodded toward the jeep. "Are you crazy?" he asked in thickly accented English. 3 men and a jeep? It was a fair question. Burris was indeed taking a wild gamble, but this wasn't a time for caution. This was a time for nerve, for the same kind of audacity that had carried him across the Vaal River. He looked the captain straight in the eye. "I've got a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me," he said calmly, "and the Russians are right behind you. So do you want to surrender to us or to them?" It was a magnificent lie. There was no army behind him, no tanks, no reinforcements, he was just an empty road. But the German captain didn't know that, and deep down he wanted to believe it. Because if no Americans were nearby, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets, and every German soldier knew what that meant. The Red Army had suffered unimaginable losses on the Eastern Front. More than 20 million Soviet citizens had died fighting Germany. The Soviets had seen their cities burned, their people enslaved, and their country nearly destroyed. When they pushed into Germany, they carried a deep hunger for revenge that terrified German soldiers. Stories spread about mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and harsh retribution. Whether those stories were true or not didn't matter. German troops believed them. The thought of falling into Soviet hands was every Wehrmacht officer's worst nightmare. American captivity, on the other hand, seemed almost civilized. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention, treated prisoners humanely, and didn't execute captured officers. The German captain knew all this. As he stood on the road facing Captain Burris, he had to make a choice. He could call the Americans bluff, order his men to disarm these 3 paratroopers, keep retreating east, and eventually fall into Soviet hands. Or he could accept the offer that this confident young American was making. A chance to surrender to the U.S. Army, to avoid the Red Army, and maybe, just maybe, survive the war. "Wait a minute," the German captain said. He turned and walked back to his men. Burris watched him gather several officers. They huddled beside a vehicle, talking animatedly. Some pointed toward Burris. Others gestured east toward the Soviets. Burris stood motionless, face calm, heart pounding. This could go either way. Finally, the captain broke away from the group and walked back. His hand moved toward his holster. Burris tensed. The 2 paratroopers beside him raised their rifles. This was it, surrender or a firefight. The German officer pulled out his pistol, pointed it at Burris's chest, then turned it around, gripped first, and held it out, the universal sign of surrender. Burris accepted the pistol and nodded. The captain saluted. Word spread quickly down the column, surrender. The Americans are here. We're giving up. German soldiers began climbing out of their trucks, stacking their rifles and laying sidearms on the ground. Officers kept order. Even in defeat, discipline held. They were still a professional army, but a defeated one. Now Burris had a new problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners, and no way to guard or transport them. No radio, no contact with his division, just 3 men in a single jeep. It was insane. So he ordered the German officers to keep their troops in line and start marching west toward American lines. They obeyed. Burris and his men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear like shepherds guiding a flock. For hours they drove, the long column stretching for miles through ruined villages and shattered checkpoints. American patrols they passed could hardly believe their eyes. Where had all these prisoners come from? Soon the story spread. Captain Burris had captured an entire Panzer Corps with just 2 men and a jeep. When Burris reached 82nd Airborne headquarters, his colonel was waiting and furious. Burris had disobeyed orders, driven into enemy territory, and taken massive risks. The colonel didn't know whether to court-martial him or award him a medal. For days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers said he'd acted recklessly. Others said he'd achieved the impossible, capturing 15,000 enemy troops without a single shot fired. In the end, results spoke louder than protocol. Burris was commended instead of punished. Years later, Burris remained humble about the whole thing. "I needed a plan fast," he said. It was simple, bluff with confidence. Give the Germans 2 choices, one better than the other, and hope they'd take it. It worked because Burris understood the German mindset in 1945. The army was broken, not just militarily, but mentally. They knew the war was lost. They were terrified of the Soviets, tired of fighting, desperate for a way out. Burris gave them one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had killed himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. His so-called 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12. The 82nd Airborne Division was chosen for occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the troops and called them America's Guard of Honor. Burris stood at attention as Patton spoke. He was 25 years old, a captain, veteran of 4 campaigns, and one of the most decorated officers in the Airborne. The war had shaped him deeply. When he came home to South Carolina, he married, started a family, and went into construction. He worked 15 years at Roebuck Building Company in Spartanburg before launching his own business, Burris Construction Company, with his sons John, Moffett Jr., and Francis. The firm handled major projects across the Southeast. Burris led it from 1970 to 1987. In 1982, his son Moffett Jr. established Burris Building Systems as a division, later turning it into a separate company in 1987. From 1977 to 1990, Burris also served in the South Carolina House of Representatives. His leadership style, direct, honest, results-driven, won respect from both sides. He became the state's first Republican minority leader and helped shape the modern GOP in South Carolina. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden. Actor Robert Redford played a composite character partly based on Burris and his actions at Nijmegen. Burris served as a consultant on the film. Watching the river crossing scenes brought back painful memories. Machine gun fire, men dying in boats, freezing water filling around him. At 80 years old, Burris published his memoir Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. His children had pushed him to write it. In the prologue, he said he needed to confront the war by reliving it with those who'd shared it. The book became a key first-hand account for military historians and veterans alike. A raw look at leadership, sacrifice, and survival. In 1994, just before turning 75, Burris made a parachute jump into Holland for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden at the original battle site in Nijmegen. 15 years later, at 90, he returned for the 65th anniversary and made a tandem jump with a female Pathfinder paratrooper. He was honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and received the Nijmegen Medal of Honor. The Dutch people never forgot. Fresh flowers still covered the graves of American soldiers. Children still learned in school about the paratroopers who crossed that wild river under fire. For Burris, those visits meant everything. The war had mattered. Freedom had been won. The sacrifice had been worth it. In 2012, at 92, Burris spoke at Fort Jackson's quarterly Profession of Arms luncheon. For nearly an hour, he held hundreds of soldiers, officers, sergeants, and staff, completely spellbound as he retold his combat experiences. He told them about blasting the lock off a concentration camp gate to free its prisoners. He told them how he'd convinced a German Panzer unit to surrender. He told them what it was like to be among the first Americans to enter Berlin after Germany's surrender. The room was silent. Everyone knew they were hearing living history from a man who represented everything the Army hoped its leaders would be. One officer who attended later said, "What struck me most was his message that real leaders lead from the front and never ask their soldiers to do anything they wouldn't do themselves." Because of his leadership, his men and those around him overcame impossible odds and completed their missions, even under the toughest conditions. In his later years, Burris spoke often about leadership, duty, and service. To soldiers, veterans, students, and community groups, his message never changed. Lead from the front, take care of your people, and they'll take care of you. For Burris, those weren't just words. They were lessons learned through blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of 15,000 German troops, Burris always downplayed his role. It wasn't about bravery or cleverness, he'd say. It was about understanding the situation. Those German soldiers were terrified of the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to Americans. All he did was give them that chance. Any officer who grasped the psychology of that moment could have done the same, but few had the nerve to try. His military decorations spoke for themselves. The Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat V for Valor, a Purple Heart, 3 Presidential Unit Citations with 2 oak leaf clusters, the French and Belgian Fourragère, and the Dutch Lanyard. The 82nd Airborne Division to which he belonged built a legendary record in World War II. 4 Medal of Honor recipients, 4 campaign streamers for Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Central Europe. They liberated camps, captured thousands of prisoners, and held key objectives against overwhelming odds. Moffett Burris died on January 4, 2019, at the age of 99. His funeral drew hundreds, veterans who'd served with him, politicians who'd worked beside him, and Dutch citizens who crossed the Atlantic to honor the man who helped free their country. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster said, "Moffett Burris was one of the finest leaders our state and nation have ever produced. He delivered freedom to people around the world and made the lives of everyone he touched better and safer." When Burris's story first made national news, headlines called it one of the most daring acts of the war. Military historians studied it as a lesson in psychological warfare and personal initiative. But Burris never sought fame. In later interviews, he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He said he was just doing his job, trying to end the war without getting anyone killed. Yet the story reveals something deeper about leadership and courage. True courage isn't the absence of fear, it's mastery over it. Burris was afraid when he faced that German column. Any sane man would be, but he controlled his fear. He projected total confidence when the odds were hopeless. He understood that war is psychological. Weapons matter, numbers matter, but mindset matters most. The German officers who surrendered to him weren't cowards. They were professionals who knew resistance was pointless. Their country was destroyed, their cause lost, and they were trapped between two superpowers. Burris offered them a rational choice: surrender to the Americans or fall to the Soviets. The fact that his bluff worked says less about deception and more about Germany's desperation in April 1945. Some historians have questioned the exact details. 15,000 is a suspiciously round number, and records don't specify precise locations. Even Burris admitted his memory blurred over time. But the core of the story stands. U.S. Army after-action reports from late April 1945 confirm large numbers of German troops surrendering with almost no resistance. Division records show Captain Burris of I Company, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was officially commended for actions related to a German surrender. Several veterans from his unit recalled hearing about it soon after it happened. What's certain is this: in the final days of the war, Moffett Burris faced a massive German formation. Armed with nothing but confidence and nerve, he convinced them to lay down their arms without a fight. The exact numbers might be unclear, but the truth remains. One man's audacity achieved what might have taken an entire army by force. The lessons from his experience go far beyond military history. They touch on human nature itself. When people are trapped between bad options, they'll reach for any hope of escape. When leaders project confidence, others follow, often against logic. When the cost of resistance outweighs the cost of surrender, even proud warriors yield. Burris instinctively understood all this. He hadn't studied psychology or strategy. He simply knew people, and that combined with courage changed the outcome of one small corner of a vast war. His story also shows the chaos of war's final days. Historians like to focus on big battles and clear strategies, but wars rarely end neatly. They collapse into confusion. Units lose communication. Soldiers act on instinct. Command structures fall apart. In that chaos, individuals like Burris could shape events in ways impossible under normal discipline. Think about what he did. He disobeyed orders to stay west of the Elbe River. He drove into enemy territory without support. He faced a force thousands of times larger than his own and lied about having reinforcements. He should have been captured or killed. Instead, he pulled off one of the greatest bluffs in modern warfare. That mix of boldness, calm, and calculated risk defines exceptional leadership. Compare that to the British tank commander at Nijmegen, who hesitated under fire despite having orders and overwhelming power. Burris, with just a jeep and 2 men, succeeded where others with tanks and artillery hesitated. The difference was mindset. In the fog of war, perception matters more than reality. If you can convince the enemy you have overwhelming force, you don't actually need it. In the years after the war, Burris often thought about how close he'd come to death. The jump into Sicily under fire, the brutal Salerno campaign, the wounds at Anzio, the river crossing where half his company died, the surrender of an entire German corps that could have ended with his execution. Surviving all that felt almost miraculous, but Burris knew it wasn't luck. He survived because he was smart, well-trained, and unshakably calm under pressure. His men followed him not because he gave orders, but because he lived by them. He never asked anyone to do what he wouldn't do himself. That kind of leadership builds loyalty that outlasts fear. And when Burris spoke about the war in his later years, he always emphasized his men, their courage, their sacrifice, far more than his own. He spoke of the privates who leaped into the darkness over Sicily, the sergeants who kept their squads together at Anzio, and the lieutenants who gave their lives leading their platoons across the wall. For Burris, the story was never about himself, it was about them. The thousands of young Americans who answered their country's call, endured unimaginable hardships, and helped defeat tyranny. In 2011, at age 91, Burris addressed the U.S. Army Chaplain Basic Officer Leadership Course. In 2017, at 97, he gave an interview to Fox News, recalling his wartime experiences with the same clarity and humility that defined his life. Even in his final years, he stayed devoted to sharing lessons of leadership and sacrifice with future generations. That was Burris's legacy. Not the medals or decorations, not the daring stories or the incredible risks, but the example he set. The standard of leadership he upheld. The way he treated his soldiers with respect and led them with courage. Young officers study his actions today not because they're cinematic, but because they show what's possible when competence meets audacity. The Jeep Burris drove toward that German column is long gone, scrapped decades ago like countless other World War II vehicles. The road where he faced 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt. The refugees who fled the Soviets are gone. The German officers who surrendered that day have passed into history. But the story endures. It endures because it captures something timeless about the human spirit. The refusal to surrender, the willingness to take impossible risks, and the understanding that confidence can be the most powerful weapon of all. In the vast story of World War II, T. Moffett Burris was just one of 16 million Americans who served. His actions were one event among thousands, yet his story shows what truly made victory possible. It wasn't just industry, firepower, or strategy. It was individual initiative. Soldiers like Burris who saw an opportunity, seized it without waiting for orders, and changed outcomes through sheer boldness. When Burris died in 2019, he was among the last of his generation. The men who jumped into Sicily are nearly all gone. The paratroopers who crossed rivers under fire have faded into memory. The veterans who liberated camps and witnessed the horrors of Nazi rule are disappearing. Soon, all that will remain are their stories. Like Burris's Bluff on a German road in April 1945. That story deserves to be remembered, not because it was ordinary, but because it wasn't. Most surrenders involved long negotiations, superior strength, or clear advantage. Burris's surrender had none of that. Just 3 men in a jeep facing 15,000 enemy soldiers. It shouldn't have worked. But Burris didn't care about what should or shouldn't work. He knew that in the chaos of war's end, old rules no longer applied. He knew desperate men believe what they need to believe. He knew confidence is contagious and that a bold bluff can beat a cautious retreat. So remember this story. Remember the school teacher from South Carolina, who became one of America's most decorated paratroopers. Remember the captain who jumped into combat 4 times and always led from the front. Remember the man who crossed a river under fire, lost half his company and kept fighting. Remember the officer who faced 15,000 enemies with nothing but nerve and convinced them to surrender. Remember T. Moffett Burris. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. Leadership means standing where you ask others to stand, and sometimes the impossible is just the improbable, waiting for someone brave enough to try. 3 men in a jeep, armed only with confidence and a bluff, changed the course of history. That was the lesson of April 1945. That was the legacy of one remarkable American soldier. It's what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary odds and refuse to believe impossible means, don't try. That jeep rolled down a German road with 3 men inside. They faced an army. They should have died. Instead, they won. And in that small victory, buried in the vastness of World War II, we find the true measure of American success, not just weapons or machines, but the audacity of soldiers who refused to believe they were outnumbered when they knew they were right.